So I see new faces, so I'll introduce myself first. I'm Rabbi דיאנה וילה. I was ordained here at Sכטר. I teach Talmud and Jewish law at the Sכטר Rabbinical School, and I also coordinate a program called Mishlei, which is a Beit Midrash with an MA, which is also a pre-rabbinic requirement. I gave this class already in February, and I was asked to repeat it here when we have the National Study Day, because many more people are coming. So you have the same handouts from February. So if somebody was here in February, it'll be repetitive. The question has to do with women of the wall and how this defies authority or the current status quo of Jewish law. But before we talk about that, I wanted to talk to you about two basic principles that we always have to take into account when we're dealing with issues of women in Jewish law. One of them is what is known as time-bound positive commandments, mitzvat aseh she'azman grama, that is, laws that have to be observed within a certain time frame. And the other is the issue of if somebody who's not commanded to do something can make somebody else observe through them. So as you know, there are 613 commandments, out of which 365 are negative, lo ta'aseh, 248 are positive, mitzvot aseh, and within those positive commandments, some of them are within a certain time frame. So the Mishnah and the Talmud talk about the fact that women are exempt from these time-bound positive commandments. I always like to point out that these things were written maybe 2,000 years ago, and they're really from a different social environment when women were at home raising children and usually not working and not studying and not having the knowledge to do a certain amount of things. So it's not, we shouldn't just dismiss it as something chauvinistic. It was written in a different time period. But we can still think it over again from our modern perspective. However, as conservative Jews, we are required to check out and see if we have the precedents to make any changes. So the first of them is what appears in Mishnah Kiddushin, all obligations of the son upon the father, men are bound but women are exempt, but all obligations of the father upon the son, both men and women are bound. This is less relevant to us, is that a certain mitzvot, like for example circumcising a son, is the father's responsibility and not the mother's, but on the other hand respecting the parents goes both ways. The children have to, both boys and girls have to respect their parents. And now the part that is relevant to us. All affirmative precepts limited to time, men are liable and women are exempt. But all affirmative precepts not limited to time are binding about both men and women. And all negative precepts, whether limited to time or not limited to time, are binding about both men and women. That is, mitzvot lo ta'aseh, what we are not allowed to do, is relevant for everyone. But there are certain exceptions. Excepting, ye shall not round the corners of your head, neither shall thou mar the corners of thy beard, and he shall not defile himself to the dead. Men are not allowed to use razors to cut their beards or their hair here at the corner of the head. And the Kohanim, the male Kohanim, are not allowed to be defiled to the dead, and that applies only to men. The Babylonian Talmud already discusses this question and wonders if this is really such a tight rule, where there are exceptions to the rule. And they ask, all affirmative precepts limited to time. Our rabbis taught, which are affirmative precepts limited to time? And they give us examples. The sukkah, which you have to observe within Sukkot itself, lulav within Sukkot, shofar during Rosh Hashanah, the fringes that is the tzitziot that you put on in the morning hours in the daytime, and the phylactery is the tzitzit. And what are examples of affirmative precepts not limited to time? The mezuzah, the battlement is that they had a kind of a fence around the roof so people can't fall off the roof, and that is not limited to time. Lost property and the dismissal of the nest, that is, if you find little birds or eggs in the nest, you have to let them go before you have to let the mother go before you can take them. So all of these are examples of affirmative precepts not limited to time. And the Talmud asks, now, is this a general principle? And they give you examples that don't really fit the principle. Unleavened bread, matzah, rejoicing on Sukkot, assembling, which is that every 7th year everybody used to get together, what is called hakhel, and hear the whole Torah. These are all affirmative precepts limited to time and yet incumbent upon women. Furthermore, study of the Torah, procreation, and the redemption of the son are not affirmative precepts limited to time, and yet women are exempt. So we see that it is not really a tight rule that applies in all of the cases. So Rabbi Yochanan answered, we cannot learn from general principles even where exceptions are stated. So the important thing is that this is one of the issues we have to take into account whenever we study anything that has to do with women in Jewish law. Are we talking about a time-bound positive commandment or not? If we are talking about a time-bound positive commandment, they're exempt, and we can think of different approaches as to whether a woman can take upon herself or not to do those commandments that she's exempt from in principle. So in the case of talit, which is a clear example of something that talit or tzitzit, that is a time-bound positive commandment, the rabbis wrote and explained different approaches to this issue of whether a woman is allowed or not, and if she is allowed, whether she can say or not a blessing, which is an extra question about this. So the first opinion is that of the Ravad. The Ravad is Rabbi Abraham ben David of Posquier, a medieval commentator, and he writes, because all the mitzvot from which women are exempt, if they do them, it is possible that they will treat them lightly or perform them incorrectly. The sages protested, like Michal bat Shaul, who used to put on tefillin, and the sages protested, since women are not careful to observe them properly. Okay, Michal bat Shaul, according to the Talmud, she used to put on tefillin. And there are two different versions of whether the sages protested or didn't protest, depending where you look, in the Babylon and the Yerushalmi. But here they take the opinion that the rabbis did protest and did not accept it. And this is the only commentator who has this point of view, where he says that it is forbidden, and that they're concerned that the woman might not do it properly. I don't think this is usually the point of view we'll hear. You know, the point of view that we'll hear forbidding it will usually be because she's not obligated, not because she can't do it properly. Okay. Even worse is the opinion of some codes that later on say that a woman doesn't know how to keep her body clean, and therefore she's not supposed to be wearing that feeling, which is even more annoying than not being able to do it properly. The second opinion is the opinion that it is permitted without a blessing, and that's what Maimonides writes. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from tzitzit from the Torah. Women and slaves who want to wrap themselves in tzitzit may do so without a blessing, and so too other positive commandments from which women are exempt. If they want to perform without a bracha, one does not protest. So Maimonides does not forbid it, but he thinks that since they're not obligated, they cannot say the blessing. Okay, this is the second point of view. And the third point of view is that it's permitted, and they may even pronounce a blessing. And that's what Rabbeinu Tam says. Rabbeinu Tam is one of the grandchildren of Rashi, and appears a lot in the Tosfot, the commentary on the Talmud. And he says, and they may recite the blessings over a positive time-bound commandment, even though they are exempt from that mitzvah, and they may occupy themselves with that mitzvah like Michal bat Kushi, who, it can be assumed, also recited the blessing. So when we're dealing with this issue, we have to think in one of these directions. Either it's forbidden, it's permitted without a blessing, or it's permitted with a blessing. And as you hear usually in the Orthodox world today, you hear more the opinion that it's forbidden or that it's permitted without a blessing, and less the idea that she should be permitted with a blessing. Up to here, any comments, questions about the issue in general of women or about the talit? Nothing. Okay. Yes.
Does exempt for me in English, exempt does not equal forbidden.
No,
so
of course.
where did they get from being exempt to forbidden?
Exempt is not forbidden. Exempt means it's not required. That's lo chayav, ken patur. That's only the Ravad. And it may be based on, there are two different versions about Michal bat Shaul, which he brings as an example, Michal, the daughter of Shaul. And according to one version, the rabbis protested, and so maybe that's a precedent that she shouldn't even put it on at all. According to a different version, the rabbis did not protest, then you wouldn't have a problem. It's a chumrah, it's a more severe way of looking at it. Like if the Bible, if the Talmud did not say that she's required, then why would she do it? Excuse me? Michal bat Kushi is what they call Michal, the daughter of Shaul. Yeah. Why? I can't hear you. I don't understand what you're asking.
Well, this was very far back.
Sure.
So did people do tefillin?
Tefillin is already in the Bible. Why not? We say it in Shema all the time. It's an ancient mitzvah, and we even have now tefillin from the time of Bar Kokhba. If you go to the Israel Museum, you'll see them. It's a really old biblical mitzvah. It's nothing new. Okay. Shulchan Aruch. We get to the 16th century. Here we were in the Middle Ages. We get to the 16th century, and Yosef Karo is the most important code of Jewish law. He includes the Sephardi law, and the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, adds the Ashkenazi perspective, and that's the gloss. And he writes about the question of wearing tzitzit or not, and the issue of time-bound positive commandments. And he writes, women and slaves are exempt from wearing tzitzit because it is a time-bound positive commandment. That's it. They're exempt. They don't have to. And he doesn't address the question of whether they could do it, whether they could say a blessing or not. He just said they're exempt. But the gloss of Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, brings very often Ashkenazi halacha, but also Ashkenazi custom. He will often say when Shulchan Aruch, when the Yosef Karo says something, he will say, but in our countries we do something else. And he lived in Krakow, and he wrote about customs of the Ashkenazi countries. So he says, in any case, if they wish to wrap in tzitzit and say the blessing on them, they are allowed to do so. As with all time-bound positive commandments, the sources he sends us to Tosfot and Rosh, etc., those were added later. It's not at all sure that the Ramah himself brought those sources, but it does appear in many medieval sources that precede the Ramah. But then he says, but it looks like haughtiness, and therefore they should not wear tzitzit. It really is like they're showing off. They're trying to say, oh, wow, we're wearing... Yes.
What's the word he uses in Hebrew?
Yohara. אם יש לך מילה יותר טובה, אז בסדר.
No, because it's just the opposite. It's new, that's all.
Yeah, well, it's like women don't have to do it. Why do they have to be showing off wearing it? So even if we could allow them to do so, it's not right. That's not what women should be doing. It's actually what he's saying here. Yes?
Because they're putting women and slaves on the same level. That means they're both workers.
No, that's nothing to do with workers. It's not workers. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the issue that certain categories that don't have the obligations, and women don't have certain obligations. Slaves don't have other obligations. We also sometimes see minors, for example, or people, or in their times when they speak about deaf, they mean people who are deaf and dumb, and therefore they're also not responsible. Or people who have some kind of a mental impediment. All kinds of reasons why somebody is not responsible, or is not obligated and is not responsible. It doesn't have to do with work. So women, since they're exempt, and slaves are exempt also, so that they paired them together there. I'm sometimes surprised that the Shulchan Aruch even mentions slaves anymore in the 16th century, because usually what was not relevant in his time, he just ignored and didn't mention. And therefore there's a big difference between the Code of Law, which is Maimonides, and his Mishneh Torah, where he includes all aspects of Jewish law, including sacrifices and temple worship, etc. And Shulchan Aruch usually does not refer to things that were not applicable in his time at all. And I don't think in the 16th century Jews had slaves anymore.
No, but there was servitude, there were serfs, there were apprentices, there's all manner of people in society who didn't necessarily have their own freedom.
No, yeah, but they're not. But well, it doesn't matter. It's a side issue anyway. So this is the first reason that we find to not to allow them to do it, is that it's considered something that they're sort of showing off, haughtiness. It happens with a Ramah that sometimes he will say, according to the law itself, it's not a problem, but we are not accustomed to do it, but it's not a good idea because of this and that. In this case, he says they're really allowed to do it, but we say it looks like they're trying to show off, etc., and therefore that's not what nice Jewish women do. Right? The second reason that the Poskim bring is that the talit is male apparel. Now, if you know that verse from Deuteronomy that talks about not wearing men's clothes, or women wearing men's clothes or men wearing women's clothes, it says a woman may not put on man's apparel, nor shall a man wear women's clothing, for whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord your God. If you check the Rashi on that verse, you'll see that the idea is that a woman wearing men's clothes, and she will be among men, and this will lead to immoral things occurring. I always think of the movie Yentl, if you saw it. So I don't think anybody today, any woman who wears pants, has the slightest notion that someone will mistake her for a man and she'll go among men to do something immoral, but maybe in those times that's what they had in mind. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the Targum Yonatan, which is really pseudo-Yonatan, because the Yonatan ben Uziel, the famous Targum, is on the prophets, and the Targum Yonatan on the Torah is much, much later, so it's not really from him. But the translation into Aramaic is that a cloak with tzitzit and tefillin shall not be worn by a woman because they are a man's apparel. Okay, that's much later. It's a late translation, but you see already the influence of this interpretation in the Aramaic translation, that when we're talking about a woman wearing tzitzit and tefillin, it's really male clothes. And I've heard this from women who tell me, I don't put on tefillin because for me it looks male. I don't know if any of you identify with that, but I've heard it many times that people feel it's a kind of men's clothing. So actually this is not a halachic proof of any kind. This translation by Yonatan is not halachic text, but very often halacha is influenced by non-halachic materials that somehow get into the codes later on. So therefore, I wanted you to know about it.
But it's a translation of the original
Hebrew. Here we have everything in translation. The Deuteronomy is original in Hebrew, and the Targum Yonatan is Aramaic. But I'm translating, they're both in English, so you can't really see it here.
But it's a translation from the Tanakh.
Right. But what happens is that if you've studied Unklus at all, he also does that sometimes. You have a Hebrew text, and suppose it has something anthropomorphic, and he doesn't like it, so his translation also includes an interpretation. So this is the same thing that happens here. The text says clothes or apparel or whatever you want to call it, and he says tzitzit and tefillin.
Because in the Bible it doesn't specifically say men's clothes, does it? It just says...
Look, Klei Gever. Yes, it does. Yes. That verse is Klei Gever. It's very clearly. It talks also about women not carrying arms and not wearing men's clothes. What?
Klei, it's not Klei.
Klei Gever, that's what it means. It's clothes.
No.
That's what it means.
says not to wear men's clothes, but when it says about tzitzit, does it specifically say that tzitzit at the corner of your clothes, it says the men's clothes?
No, I'm saying that they use the verse that says that women shouldn't wear men's clothes, and when he translated, he interpreted to mean tzitzit and tefillin. That doesn't say at all in the Bible.
That's what I'm saying.
No, I'm talking about the verse that talks about...
specifically that the tzitzit has to be on...
No, I'm just saying he's interpreting the verse on men's clothes to mean tzitzit and tefillin.
Yeah.
It's not the section that's explicitly about tzitzit that we're talking about. It's the section that talks about wearing male clothes, and that's what he interprets to mean tzitzit and tefillin. Again, this is not a halachic ruling, but it has influenced later rulings, and it influences how people see tzitzit and tefillin. Famous Rabbi Feinstein, I'm sure you all heard of him, was a famous Orthodox posek in the United States in the 20th century. His book of responsa called Igrot Moshe. And there was a case where they talked to him about women in Boston in the 70s that wanted to put on talit. And he wrote a responsa, which is very often referred to on this issue. And he said, every woman is indeed allowed to fulfill even those mitzvot which the Torah does not command them to do, and they earn reward for performing these mitzvot. In fact, according to the Tosfot, they can even recite a blessing over the mitzvah, and the Ashkenazi custom is for them to perform the mitzvah of shofar and lulav, the 4 pieces, and they recite a blessing on them. So first of all, according to the law, it's not a problem. Therefore, on the mitzvah of tzitzit, it would also seem to apply if a woman wants to wear a 4-cornered garment, though it should differ from typical men's clothing, and tie tzitzit and carry out this mitzvah. So it shouldn't be a problem that a woman takes a 4-cornered garment and puts on the tzitzit. He already says that it should look different from the typical male talit, but it's not a problem. But then he adds, but this is clearly if she has a heartfelt urge to keep mitzvahs, even when not commandment. It has to be a woman who really, it's in her such a strong urge that she needs to put it on, otherwise she's going to feel awful. However, since in the present case, and he's talking about that case in Boston in the 70s, this is not the intention, I don't really know what the case is, but rather resentment toward Hashem Yitbarach and His Torah, this is not an act of performing a mitzvah at all, but the very opposite, a prohibited act, the prohibition of heresy, for she thinks Torah laws can be replaced. Now, Feinstein was really the biggest authority that was accepted. So when he said something, people keep on referring to what he said. He said it's not really a problem, but the bottom line is better don't do it. And he's quoted for this as a precedent that women should not put on.
How can you prove kavanah without being ihira or being...
But before they already said it looks like Yohara, and they also, how do they know that? They also don't know that. And here, look, I know some people might not agree, but I sometimes get that feeling also with this. We'll go to Women of the Law in a while, but when you see women who really never put on talit, and then they go there and they put it on to show it, to say, we are women and we have to have this right, etc., at some level you get that feeling that it's not from love of God and that you can't pray if you don't have a talit on you. It's you're doing something else. You're trying to make a point about women's rights, not necessarily because you can't live without putting on a talit. So there is a very big difference, and even if some women don't like to hear this. Men are obligated to a whole bunch of things by Jewish law, whether they like it or not. If they don't do it, they're sinning. Women are not obligated from a whole bunch of stuff because they felt they were considering the fact that they were homemakers and raising kids and really didn't know in certain aspects of everyday life, etc. And so they're not obligated. So even if they can take upon themselves the obligation, they are not obligated by law. It's a different case. Men, even if they don't do it, they're obligated by law. Okay. So, okay. Now the second thing that I want to talk about is the issue of the Western Wall itself. Unless you have more questions up to this point. Okay. And the Western Wall, anybody who saw pictures of it up to 67, first of all, it was a very small passage before they tore down all the houses there. Second of all, it never had a mechitza. And there are pictures for hundreds of years that they're mixed people standing next to the wall. At the end of these handouts, you have Rabbi Golinkin's articles about this, and he has a whole article about the Kotel as a synagogue or not as a synagogue. And after 67 is when they put up the mechitza that keeps going further up, and each time you see less from the women's side. But they treat it as an Orthodox synagogue as though it always was. Okay, maybe 40-something years is a long time, but hundreds of years before is much longer. So today they tell us it's a synagogue. It's like an Orthodox synagogue, and it has minhag makom, the custom of the place. And what are these women who come here and do something different from what the custom of the place is? Okay, I don't go to the Women of the Wall, and I don't feel the urge to do that. Okay, but it was never an Orthodox synagogue in the past, and today they treat it as though that's what it always was, and that's what it is. So, first of all, there's a source here from Maimonides about an open space, a plaza in a city, and what kind of level of sanctity it has. Because a synagogue has a level of sanctity in view of the prayers that are said there on a regular basis. An open space in the city not necessarily has the same status. So Maimonides says the plaza of a city, which is used for prayer on public fast days and the like, is not sacred because it is temporary and was not fixed for prayer. And so too, houses and courtyards where the people gather in for prayer are not sacred because they were not specified only for prayer. Rather, they are for temporary prayer, like a person who prays in his house. Yet today, you hear more that not only the front part of the kotel, which is used for the last 40-odd years as a prayer place and permanently, the back part of it, the higher courtyard, which is where they have all these ceremonies for parachuters and all kinds of things, they're also wanting to give that whole extra area the status of a holy synagogue, that even there women wouldn't be able to pray in women's minyan with talit, etc. And the higher part of it is really not even remotely a prayer space. It's the, you know what I mean, the higher part of it after the mechitza section. That is certainly not a synagogue. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef wrote about. Sorry.
You mean the men's section?
No. You have the men's and the women's section, and the mechitza finishes, and then you have like a courtyard that keeps going up.
Oh, okay.
Right? It's like further away from the wall. And that's where they usually have the paratroopers and all that kind of stuff. And even that section today, according to the Orthodox authorities there, have some kind of a holy status. And that is for sure not. Because that doesn't even have, for the last 40-odd years, prayer. The bottom part, since 67, has been used sort of like an Orthodox prayer space. But the top part isn't at all. And yet you will hear some people who will say that even the top part is like holy, and how can women even come and pray even out there, right? So that's why if we look at the early legal sources, we see that a courtyard, an open space like that, is definitely doesn't have at all a status of a synagogue. Okay. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, which he unfortunately has been saying all kinds of things lately, but he is a really unbelievable Talmid Chacham. I mean, when there's an issue that I don't know enough about and I want to get my bearings, first thing I do is to see if he wrote about it, because it's unbelievable. This rabbi is really an impressive Talmid Chacham. He'll bring you all the sources. He'll bring them from the beginning to now. He'll bring you rabbis you didn't even hear of that are some obscure Sephardi rabbi that lived somewhere that only he knows, but he'll bring you everything. And therefore it's really worthwhile reading what he has to say. I think some of the things he says today have to do with the fact that he's also the spiritual leader of a party, and that he says things that his followers want to hear, and maybe they can't hear all the subtle things that he's capable of saying, but I've used his responsa when I've written, and he really says incredible stuff. So he says in one of his responsa, and I am not oblivious to the fact that the Western Wall is used as a prayer site by tens of thousands of Jews and is considered a minor sanctuary. Minor sanctuary is they used to describe a synagogue. It's a term to compare it to the temple, right? The temple was the great sanctuary, and the synagogues, some way replaced the temple that we don't have anymore, and it's called, using a phrase from Yechezkel, a minor sanctuary. According to the Jewish law, like every synagogue. And the plaza in front of the Western Wall is sanctified by Jews' prayers. It is a rabbinic sanctity like the synagogues, and in any case it is not sacred like the Temple Mount. I think you probably all know that the Western Wall is not the Temple Wall. It's like an external wall. It's not, and it's obviously, even if it were, where people pray is outside of it. So you can't try and apply all the rules that have to do with sanctity and impurity and all the rest of it for something which is outside the Temple Mount. And he wants to make it very clearly in that responsum that it is a synagogue, the front part, according to Rabbi Yosef, but it certainly doesn't have the status of something like the temple, right? In view of all these different viewpoints about how to look at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, about its level of sanctity, etc., Rabbi Golinkin in his article suggested a few things. First of all, that the lower area near the Kotel should continue to serve as an Orthodox synagogue. He says in that article that he wrote, it's been like an Orthodox synagogue since '67, so maybe we should leave it as that. Right now we have this whole discussion with the Sharansky that's trying to find a middle way. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but there's very strong opposition by all the Haredim and Rav HaKotel and the rest of it. I'm not sure I agree with him, but this is what he says in that article. Then he says the upper plaza, the one we were just talking about, that was never, even today is not a synagogue, that doesn't have the mechitza, the top part of it should not be considered a synagogue. And Robinson's Arch, which is the Kotel HaMasorti, which is the continuation of the same Kotel inside the archaeological garden, should serve Jews from all denominations. It should be open all day long without an entrance fee, and sidurim and talitot should be provided there. That's part of what they're talking about today. Upgrading the Robinson's Arch area so that should serve. Now, the women of the wall never accepted this from the very beginning. The conservative movement and the reform movement, they have egalitarian services in Robinson's Arch. For many years already, the women of the wall never accepted that. They wanted to have it all-female Torah readings on the women's section of the main kotel that we use today. I don't know what everybody else thinks, but this is what he suggests here in that article, Rabbi Golinkin, that maybe that should be the solution. I'm not sure that he would think the same today after all that's happened in the last couple of years. This was written in 2011, where he suggested that maybe we should give up using that part and just upgrade the other section, and continuation of the wall. Actually, the wall, I don't know if you've ever been inside the tunnels, the Kotel tunnels, and you've seen it. The wall the main Kotel today is really a very, very small section of the wall that goes on in both directions and goes down also for many, many meters. So in a way, what we use today, the Kotel Masorti, is the same wall. It's just that for the last maybe 2,000 years, or this little piece that we've been using now is what has become sanctified. So now I want to open it to discussion, the last few minutes. what you think about the talit and the kotel and wearing a talit at the kotel as women, and we'll, yeah.
You use the word sanctified. I mean, I wanted to ask you if there was a way of making a case for the fact that people fetishize the kotel, and that in fact, at some level, we're even approaching a matter of avodah zarah. It's just rocks.
Did you read Leibovitz? Yeshayahu Leibovitz used to say that. He used to say that's exactly what was happening. There is no such thing in Judaism. If any of you have read the book The Shabbat by Heschel about how Judaism sanctifies time and not place, it's always much more important the holy time than the holy place. And people putting in the little pieces of blessings in the walls and the crooks in the walls, and people sending faxes that are being put into the wall and all the rest of it, and thinking that you have, it's like the red phone directly to the sky, to heaven, to God there, is not my cup of tea. But some people...
No, I understand that people do it, and I understand that it's important, but on the other hand, I don't know if anybody at some point is saying, stop. As you are saying, you're saying, this area should not be considered a synagogue. This area should not be considered sanctified or holy. And indeed,
but even if it weren't a synagogue, you could still want to go there to pray because you feel it's the closest place that you could be to Temple Mount or something like that. You know.
But it would be, like you said, it would be the fact that people gathered there that there was a minyan that would sanctify it, not the fact that
because you need 10 people to it says in the Torah, "V'nikdashti betoch bnei Israel," and it means you need a minyan, you need 10 adults to be able to do certain parts of the services and the prayers. You can't read Torah, you can't do Chazarat Hashatz, you can do a whole bunch of things if you don't have 10. But that doesn't mean that you need a certain place. You need to have 10 adult Jews who can get together and do it. So in that sense, that's what makes it sanctified. An empty synagogue where nothing ever happens, I mean, it still has Torah scrolls, it still has something, but it's not the same. What matters is what's happening there. And it's true that for the last 40-odd years, it's been used as an Orthodox synagogue. With the mechitza, it keeps going up, yeah.